Get it?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, welcome to Biblical Archaeology. You have your new handouts, so you have the old handouts and the new handouts. And we are going to continue right along where we left off last time. But first, does anyone have any questions from last time? And Phil, don't ask what I missed.
What was last week?
Don't ask, did I miss anything important?
Can we make it up?
Can you do extra credit? No. Okay, thank you. Now, so let's look at, if you turn in your handout from last week, and let me see where we left off. I think we went through Abraham's travels, and so we're on page 5. And the first thing I want to look at, which is misspelled on your handout, is the Ebla tablets. So I spelled it Elba. It's the Ebla tablets. The Ebla, E-B-L-A, tablets give insight to Sodom and Gomorrah. So we read in the Bible that there were these towns of Sodom and Gomorrah. You know what happened to them. And so archaeologists have been interested in going around finding, can we find these towns? Now the Ebla tablets give some insight into Sodom and Gomorrah, and archaeologists think that they have found where those towns are. Although, you know, when you're looking for a town that's thousands of years old, often it's not just going to be there with buildings, and especially one that's been burned. But even a town that didn't get burned up, they're generally going to be buried under layers. So archaeologists have excavated these sites. The Ebla excavation is relatively recent. It began in 1964. And the city of Ebla, it was at its prominence in 2300 BC. Now you remember, just to keep in mind the time frame, if you look at Abraham's travels, so Abram was born roughly 1975 BC, and Joseph entered Egypt approximately 1707. So you can keep that as a framework. So now you see that Ebla was at its prominence in 2300 BC, so a few centuries before Abram. It had a population of 230,000. And it was destroyed in 2250 BC. In Ebla, they found about 17,000 tablets that have been excavated. I don't know if it's still a continuing excavation or not, but they found about 17,000. And these tablets show, again, this was so 2300 BC, so we're looking roughly 1,000 years before Moses. They show that there was writing in that region, and that there was detailed writing about customs, laws, and events. Now this is a particularly important topic that I keep bringing up because remember, there was in the 19th century a big criticism that came up of the Torah, of the first 5 books, where a German historian said, there's no way that Moses could have written the Torah in the 15th century. He said because they didn't have writing back then in the 15th century. And even if they did have writing, they certainly didn't have the ability to write down, or they weren't interested in the detailed writing down of customs and of laws. But last week I showed such things as the Code of Hammurabi that predates Moses by about 3 centuries. And here we have the Ebla tablets, 1,000 years before Moses, that show that there was writing in the region and that there was detailed writing about customs, laws, and events. So that basically debunks that idea from the 19th century that the Torah could not have been written in Moses' time. Okay, what else? The Ebla tablets demonstrate elaborate judicial proceedings and case law, and in the Ebla tablets we find a lot of, it looks similar to what we find in Deuteronomy. Now, historically, some of the things that we see in the Ebla tablets. So Genesis 14, and for homework, if you want to go back, we won't read it now, but peruse it. Genesis 14 gives accounts of Abraham's victory over a king named Chedorlaomer. Just call him Chet. Chedorlaomer. And the Mesopotamian kings that had in the past been considered fictitious. So people like in the 19th century reading the Bible said, and these are people who didn't want to believe the Bible, but anyway, they said, we've never heard of these kings that the Bible says Abraham conquered. They must not have existed, not giving the Bible the benefit of the doubt. So the 5 cities of the plain, and it mentions in Genesis 14, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. And they said those are just legendary cities. But the Ebla archives refer to all 5 of these cities. The tablets reflect, hey Shannon, you can come in and have a seat. The tablets reflect that before the catastrophe that's recorded in Genesis 14, the area was a prosperous region, just like Genesis records. Shannon, will you make sure the video is working? Okay, thank you. Now, earlier critics once said that there were none of these civilizations and cities. People said those cities never existed that are written about in the Bible. The region was desolate in the time of Abraham. But archaeologists have uncovered actually more than 70 sites in the Jordan Valley, some of them as ancient as 3000 BC. So that's a wonderful thing that archaeology has shown, just that all these places that are written about early in Genesis, that they did actually exist. Okay, any questions so far? Driving on. Do I go too fast? Good. Okay, I went slow last week. So. Okay, Sodom and Gomorrah, where were they? There are 2 places that archaeologists think Sodom actually existed, and these places, I haven't even bothered to spell them for you, but they're called Bed Edra and Tal El Haman. I'm sure I pronounced those wrong. But the main point is archaeologists have found 2 places, and there's kind of like competing teams of archaeologists. One team thinks, yes, this is it for sure, and the other team thinks, yes, this is it for sure, and I'm sure many are in the middle, not sure. But to me, the important thing is archaeologists have actually located where they think it is, where they think it was. The place that's probably the best candidate, Bab Edra, its destruction was in about, they're not sure, but at about the time that, it's hard to date when a place got destroyed, but at about the time that we read in the Bible. There were houses, cemetery houses that were burned. Now normally when there's a fire, such as like in any building that we know, when there's a fire, it starts on the ground. I know they didn't have kitchens, like we do back then, but it starts on the ground and works its way up the walls and then consumes everything. They found these cemetery houses where the fire started on the roof and then made its way down. And so archaeologists think, okay, that's a possibility for Sodom, because the fire came down from the sky. And so just that, I'm amazed that they could identify that the fire started on the roof and then worked its way down. But so that's one of the indicators that maybe this place was the Sodom. Critics have, particularly in the 19th century, pointed to their anachronisms in the Bible, meaning, again, the 19th century criticism of the Bible was, and particularly the Old Testament, the first 5 books, was this belief that the Bible, the Torah, wasn't really written in the time of Moses in the 15th century, but rather it was written during the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century. And so they would say, back in the 19th century, AD, they would say none of these places existed, and there were things that are written about in the Bible that didn't exist in the 15th century, that only a 6th century BC person would have made this error. And so archaeology has found, no, those really weren't anachronisms. Some critics used to say that there were no domesticated camels during the time of Abraham, or that the Philistines didn't arrive in the area until much later, like 10th century BC. But we find in texts from the 1800 BC that the Philistines did exist in that area. We find artwork from back in that time of people riding camels. We find bones of camels that they can date from earlier. We find in Egypt, about 2200 BC, artwork showing people leading camels around. So it's neat what art can tell us, just what people were drawing, that is a historical record that, yes, camels actually did exist in the region. The Philistines, let's see. Back page, page 6. I was very optimistic when I printed this out for August 20th. I was supposed to get through all this the first week. Okay, so we're finally finishing it. So the Philistines They were of Minoan ancestry. They were people from ancient Crete or the Aegean Islands. And I gave you this map right here. So what we're looking at is on the back you're basically looking at Greece, where it says Peloponnesus. That's basically modern day Greece. You have the Aegean Sea, you have Anatolia, that's where Turkey is now. You have Crete. And so the Minoans, the Philistines, originally came from those islands, the islands in the Aegean Sea, and also from Crete. Philistines were referred to by the natives of the Canaan area as the sea people. So at some point they made their way over and they settled. In the Middle Bronze Age, which is 2000 to 1500 BC, and just to remind you, on the front page of this handout, I laid out approximately when the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. So Middle Bronze Age, 2000 to 1500 BC. Now again, give that some historical context for you. 2000 would be right before Abram was born. 1500 would be a little bit before the Exodus. So in the Middle Bronze Age, Minoans established colonies on the Canaan coast and Egypt. So the Philistines had somewhere in that Middle Bronze Age moved on in. There is the Phaistos disc, and you can see the image down below. This is found in Crete, 1600 BC. And it says there on your handout, Linear B. Linear B is a language historians of language, have identified this language that is a precursor to Greek. So it's like Greek, but a bit more ancient. So they found this disc that's written in this pre-Greek language of Linear B. And it has symbols including a man's head. I know it's, can't zoom in. I didn't zoom in enough, but somewhere on there, this will be like a Where's Waldo puzzle for you. Somewhere in there, I want to say it's on the right-hand side, but I can't remember. There's an image of a man's head and the same hat that the Philistines wear in Egyptian art, a plumed head. So somewhere in your Where's Waldo image, there's a man with a plumed hat. And so they found this in Crete, where the Philistines came from. They also find artwork of this same headgear in Egypt. So this just backs up the notion that these were people who had come from the Crete area and had moved into Egypt. What else? Critics have said that there is no evidence of Joseph being the number 2 in Egypt. You read the story of Joseph. He was made up to be the number 2 in Egypt. And we haven't found still any written evidence of Joseph, of someone by the name of Joseph being the number 2 in Egypt. But there is a linguistic problem with simply looking for the name of Joseph. It's that he wouldn't have been identified in the nation of Egypt by his name Joseph, by his Hebrew name. He had an Egyptian name, and we don't know what his Egyptian name was. It's kind of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel. When you move to another nation, they change their names. For those guys, it was involuntary. But Joseph would have taken on an Egyptian name. We don't know. The Bible doesn't say what that Egyptian name was. The Bible gives a Hebrew transcription, and so there's some homework. You can look up and find it does give his name, but it's a Hebrew transcription of the Egyptian name. And whenever you go from one language to another and you try to write in one language what another language said of a proper name, it gets ugly. And so while we do have in the Bible the Hebrew version of his name, we don't know what his Egyptian name truly was. So a linguistic problem. Also, later foreign rulers that came in defaced a lot of monuments and stone writings. So it's hard to tell. It's hard to find these writings from that time in Egypt because a lot of monuments get defaced. So one big idea in archaeology is that in the 19th century AD, there was some speculation that the Torah could not have written in the time of Moses because it was believed there was no writing at the time. There was certainly no writing of laws and things that we find in Deuteronomy. But many discoveries, such as the Code of Hammurabi, such as the tablets that I've been talking about these few weeks, disprove this assertion. So there is now no rational basis for thinking that the Torah was written at a later date. Okay, that finishes what I intended to get done in week 1. So any questions so far? All right. Let's move on then to the Exodus, so you can switch handouts. No questions? Nothing?
I do have one question. Where are the two locations that you referred to for Sodom and Gomorrah?
I don't know. I didn't put them on the map, certainly. And actually, I can give you, if I had my pen, I could write down the names for you. You know what? It's worth a Google search, maybe. Those are the names of the places, and I've probably misspelled them a bit, but you can maybe Google search. I wasn't prepared to give that. Yeah. Any other questions? I think she ran to get me a pen. Oh, excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now the real question is, do they work?
That's why I brought you.
Okay, so as I write these down, I'm gonna take that from you. As I write these down.
Okay, you can.
Okay. You might be looking at a distortion of the name because I was furiously scribbling, taking notes in this class that I took, and so I'm assuming the professor had them spelled right, but then how I spelled them, and then when I was actually typing those up, how I read my scribbled notes. But I think this is basically it. Something about the spelling of this word doesn't seem right, but what do I know? These are perhaps distorted spellings, and I even have in my notes that I have spelling questions about this. I was furiously scribbling. But if you Google search those, Wikipedia will probably bring up, did you mean this? And you say, yeah, that's what I meant. Okay, any other questions on that? Okay, let's then go on to the Exodus on the next handout. So, when did the Exodus occur? If you look in 1 Kings 6:1, 1 Kings 6:1, we have ways that internally in the Bible we can date the Exodus. What does the Bible say, first of all? 1 Kings 6:1, I'll read it to you. In the 480th year, after the Israelites had come out of Egypt. Okay? Now, this passage is talking about the building of Solomon building the temple. So again, it says, in the 480th year after the Israelites had come out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. So the 480th year after Exodus, the 4th year of Solomon's reign. So we know when Solomon reigned. Basically, the 4th year of Solomon's reign is 967 BC. 479 years earlier, because this is the 480th year after. So we subtract 479 years, the way they counted years back then. Earlier was 1446 BC. So that's generally the agreed upon time among biblical scholars of when the Exodus took place. So 1446. Judges 11:26, I won't read it, but it talks about in the time of Jephthah, which is roughly 1100 BC. We don't have an exact year. It just says in the time of Jephthah. But what it does say, we know it's talking about 1100 BC. And it talks about in that past, I really should read it. So Judges 11:26. Judges. Matthew, Mark, Luke, I'll never find it. Okay. Judges 11:26. It says, for 300 years, Israel occupied Heshbon, Aror, the surrounding settlements, and all the towns along the Arnon. Why didn't you retake them during that time? Okay, so it's referring to, at this particular time in Judges, for 300 years, Israel occupied these places. So it was written, this in the time of Jephthah was approximately 1100 BC. If Israel's been occupying, then for 300 years. And then you add into it, they were wandering in the desert for 40 years. So you add all those up. So it gives a time for the Exodus of about, do the math there, 1440, so roughly 1440s. So that's another way of, it doesn't accurately pinpoint the Exodus, but it confirms what we see in the 1 Kings 6:1. So we settle on about 1446. Now this lines up with, in case you're ever on Jeopardy, Egypt's 18th dynasty in the late Bronze Age, 1500 to 1200 BC. Now, there is an idea, good morning, there's an idea of that the Exodus occurred in the 1300, we have the chairs, okay, thank you. That the Exodus occurred in not the 15th century, but in the 13th century. Now, biblical scholars don't go with that, but some historians say maybe the Exodus happened in the 13th century. So the reason is that there was one time when archaeologists saw such evidence. There's a city name called Ramses that's mentioned in the Bible, and they related it to the 13th century pharaoh. And they figured, well, in the Bible is mentioned this city named Ramses. Ramses the pharaoh didn't rule till the 13th century, so maybe the Exodus didn't occur till then, because how could they name the city after him 200 years before he was born? Also, the critics said that 480 years, mentioned in 1 Kings 6:1, was maybe a figurative number. That 1 Kings 6:1 isn't really literally referring to 480 years, but perhaps it just means 12 generations, and assuming 40 generations per year. But 1 Kings 6:1, written, you take it as a historical document, and the language of it that I just read, it seems to actually be pinpointing it. There's no need, and in the spring I taught a class a bit about hermeneutics, how we interpret the Bible. There's no need to resort to, maybe that's a figurative number. It seems like they mean 480. What they have found in Egypt that backs up that there were these people the Israelites, who originally lived in the Canaan area and then moved in Egypt. They found archaeologists have found Canaanite tools and weapons, because remember the Israelites had previously lived up there. They found in Egypt temple architecture and gods from Canaan, idols and things like that. Again, indicative of that there was a group of people, a large population of people, that had once been in Canaan and moved down to Egypt. Even though at the time there were only 70 of them. The brothers and their families. Long-haired sheep from Canaan. So we find biologically just evidence that there were long-haired sheep, which are a species that have been in Canaan. So when Jacob and his sons moved down, they brought all the long-haired sheep. Roughly 20% of the pottery in Egypt that we find is Canaan type, is the type from that Canaan area. And there are monumental, I put singular, tomb, there is a monumental tomb with a large statue of an Asiatic or Semitic official. So there's a lot of Canaanite influence that we find archaeologically in Egypt. Okay. In Egypt, around 1700 BC, we find written in, whether it's tablets or whatever kind of writings, we find Semitic names. So basically Israelite names or names from the Canaanite area, including specifically Yaakov El, which is kind of like Jacob. And there are many inscriptions with Semitic names. Okay, I'd like to read to you Exodus 1, 6 through 11. So this is the beginning of Exodus. If you're reading through the Bible, you get to the end of Genesis, and Jacob and all his sons moved into Egypt. And now we go to Exodus. Exodus 1, verse 6. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly, and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, so this will be a new pharaoh, who did not know about Joseph, came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. So you know that story. Let's talk about what history says, what archaeology says about this. There you have on page 2 a typical picture. This is a pharaoh being depicted right here. It was probably, and down below, for your aid, I wrote a list of pharaohs. So you can see down below it starts with Amosi the First. Amosi the First was most likely the new king that Exodus 1:8 wrote about. And if you're interested, you can read more about these pharaohs, go to Wikipedia, something like that. But Amosi the First, he was probably that new pharaoh who didn't know about Joseph. Now, it sounds weird, especially in our day of, internet, you can look things up. Why wouldn't this king know about Joseph? Didn't they have historical records? This Amosi the First, he was from Upper Egypt. He was from a totally different region. Now, when you look on the map, Upper Egypt is down below, and Lower Egypt is up above. It has to do with the flow of the Nile River. So Upper Egypt, if you look on it, I didn't provide you a map of Egypt. Here you go. This is from the first 2 weeks, and this is today's. Okay. So Amosi came in from down south, from Upper Egypt, and so he and his family actually would not have been familiar with the culture of Egypt, of Lower Egypt, which is where the government was. So he came in and kicked out the Hyksos dynasty. So Hyksos was just this ruling family that had been around for many, many centuries. He came in from the south and kicked them out and he actually reestablished Egyptian rule because the Hyksos dynasty wasn't completely Egyptian. And so he and his family from down south might not have known about what had been going on in Egypt for several centuries. Now, we see in writings, there's much mention of Jewish and Nubian slaves. So in Exodus, of course, we know that they were made slaves. So there's mention in writings about these Semitic slaves. There is artwork. Hold on, what am I writing up? Yes, okay, I'm on page 3 now. We will constantly refer back to that list of pharaohs on page 2. There is artwork in the tomb of a fellow named Rekmir, who was the vizier under Thutmose III of the 15th century BC. And Thutmose, if you look on page 2, some of those pharaohs are in bold print, some of them are not in bold print. For extra ease of reference, I've put in bold print anybody that I actually mention in my lesson. So Thutmose III, so there's artwork in the tomb of Rekmir, who was an official under Thutmose III. And this artwork of the 15th century BC, again, the time of the Exodus, shows slaves making mud bricks. And so that's the kind of thing that the Israelite slaves were doing. Ramses, it mentions this town of Ramses. Now, critics have said, and I said this a few minutes ago, that Ramses, the great pharaoh Ramses, wasn't a pharaoh. He didn't come around till the 13th century. So why would they have built this city named after this pharaoh 200 years prior? Well, Ramses doesn't necessarily mean this person's name. Ramses just in that language means beloved of Ra, Ra being their sun god. And so it could have referred to somebody else. It is possible that the name Ramses was changed by a later scribe copying the Bible, that it at the time had some name and then someone else changed it. We really don't know, but there are reasons why just the fact that the famous Ramses that we know of in history didn't live till 13th century, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Exodus didn't happen till the 13th century. We have the princess Hatshepsut. She is the one who rescued baby Moses. And so you can read about that in Exodus, on the Nile River. So her name is Hatshepsut. She reigned as pharaoh from 1504 to 1482 BC. I think she was the second female to reign as pharaoh in Egypt. So that's when she reigned. Again, this would be during the lifetime of Moses, but about 40 years before the Exodus. She was born to, her father was Thutmose I. She succeeded her husband Thutmose II as pharaoh. She was actually co-regent, so she ruled with Thutmose III. Thutmose III was a child at the time when he inherited it, so she ruled alongside him. Now, she ruled with him. For whatever reason, Thutmose III, when he became in charge after she passed away, he tried to obliterate all history of her. So he went through and erased her history. For whatever reason, I don't know, he had a chip on his shoulder. I don't know. But he tried to erase a lot of memory of her. Now,
Does it have her name in the Bible?
no. She's mentioned in Exodus as the prince, I think the daughter of the Pharaoh. We had an Egyptologist come to Porterville College very recently, like within the past 2 years, and gave a talk on her. But yeah, that's all I remember. Now, earlier, the 18th dynasty in Egypt had a very powerful military, especially under Thutmose III. He is known for many, many military campaigns. In Egypt, prior to the Exodus, military campaigns were very prolific and successful during the period just before the Exodus. And then there's a point in the mid-1400s, just about the time of the Exodus, when history shows military campaigns just suddenly stopped from Egypt. So they were very militaristic, and then they stopped. With Amenhotep II, no mention of military campaigns. Amenhotep III, he more focused on art than on military. Nothing until, or not too much military action until about 100 years later. Why? Well, because we see in the Bible the army got wiped out. So they had a great army, they were doing military campaigns, and then suddenly no military campaigns for a century. And it ties in with the story of the army getting wiped out with the river, the Nile River.
Red Sea.
What's that?
Red Sea.
I'm sorry, the Red Sea. Something felt weird about it when I was saying it. Thank you, the Red Sea. But someone knows the Bible. All right. Okay. There's a period called the Amarna period. You don't have to write that down, it won't be on the test. But Canaanite kings, this is after the Exodus, asked Egypt for help to suppress a group of people. I don't know if I wrote this down. No. To suppress a group of people. So we have documents and letters, basically. Will you please come up into Canaan, Egypt, because we have this group of people called the Apiru. Now, this sounds like Hebrew, and it's basically the Hebrew people. Come help us suppress them. And Egypt didn't send any help. Canaan at that time was a vassal region for Egypt. Egypt was not able to help them. Also, the palace district was abandoned during the time of Amenhotep II, and it's believed, if you tie that in with the Bible, why? Because of the plagues that came through. So it's neat that archaeologically we see things that tie in nicely with what we read happened in Exodus. There's a historian. Well, I didn't write any of this on my... Oh, wait, I skipped things.
There's some on the back on page 4.
Huh. Well, I'm just skipping around, aren't I? Right, okay. Go back to page 3. I'm sorry about that. I'm just skipping things in my notes. I think I deleted something from my notes. Right above the picture of the Sphinx, I'm sorry about that. It says, I wrote, Moses fled to Midian for 40 years until the Pharaoh died. And so as we try to line up, okay, which Pharaoh are we talking about? Because the Bible doesn't name the pharaohs. So archaeologists and historians look at historically which pharaohs reigned for a long, long time, for 40 years, enough that Moses had to wait for more than 40 years because Moses fled and waited it out till this pharaoh died. And so the only one that we find who reigned that long is Thutmose III, who reigned, we believe, for 54 years. And so Then the next person after him, Amenhotep II, I keep flipping back to page 2. Amenhotep II, he took the throne about 4 years prior to the Exodus. And so it's believed that Amenhotep II was the pharaoh of during the Exodus. There's an inscription at the base of the Sphinx, and there's the Sphinx in the desert, that says that Mossi IV was, and he was the pharaoh after the Exodus, was given divine right to be pharaoh as he took over for his brother Amenhotep II, who probably died during the Exodus. Okay, I think that's all I want to say about that. Let's see, what else? I write on page 4 about Manetho, but this will be a teaser here. It's 9:40, and so I try to stop class at 9:40. But I'm not going to stop yet. Wait. Let me just go on for 2 more minutes. Manetho, he was an Egyptian historian of the 3rd and 4th century BC. So now we're talking 1,000 years after the Exodus, roughly, actually 1,100 years. And he wrote a book called Egyptiaca, basically a story about Egyptian history. And he wrote about the Exodus. He wrote that the Israelites left, they established the nation of Judea. He wrote that eventually the capital became Jerusalem. He relates the Exodus to a king. And he calls that king Amenophis, which sounds a lot like Amenhotep, but this is how it was spelled. It's a misspelling of Amenhotep. And actually, we don't have Manetho's writings anymore. What we see is, I misspelled Josephus' name, I'm sorry. Josephus was writing about Manetho's writing and describing it. Now, Josephus believed that the king was fictitious. He believed that this Amenophis was fictitious. He didn't even know about Amenhotep. So what we're reading is Josephus' writing describing Manetho's writing, describing the Exodus. So between all these describing and describing, you're going to get the name misspelled a little bit. But there's this mention of this king Amenophis being related to the Exodus. Okay, next time we will pick up right here, looking at Egyptian influence in the Amarna letters. And that'll do it. So Shannon, could you do that? Thank you.